Hello! Today we're going to be tackling the shooting menu for the Nikon D3500. There's a lot to get through today, so let's get into it. So today's video is meant to pair with a video that I did recently that was on the quick menu for the Nikon D3500. If you have not seen that, please go check it out. I go through the quick menu of the camera in total, with the exception of flash options, which I'm going to cover in a separate video. Please do check that out, because in today's video we're going to go through the shooting menu of the 3500, and I will be skipping over anything that's duplicated in the quick menu. So I'll be skipping over that today, but I do have another video covering those subjects. We're going to make one brief stop in the playback menu, but this is not going to cover the playback menu in full. And in a separate video, the next one that I post will be on the tools menu in total, so keep an eye out for that. There's a lot to get through today, so let's get into it.
So we are here looking at our shooting screen, and we've got our quick menu information up, and we're going to just press the menu button, and we're going to see our submenus on the left. We're going to spend only just a brief period of time in the playback menu with one thing that I think is absolutely essential to turn on, even for just shooting. But we're going to spend this video, as I've already said, in the shooting menu. But let's look at these submenus here. So I'm highlighting on the left with the playback menu in blue. And if I scroll down, I can choose different submenus here. And so here we're going to go from the playback to the shooting menu. So this is how the camera is operating when it's shooting pictures. Next is the setup menu, so how the camera is operating behind the scenes. That's going to be my next video. After that is going to be the retouching menu, so the little bit of editing and retouching that you can do in camera. And then lastly is going to be the recent settings. Now, recent settings is a really useful submenu here, because it's the things that you've looked at recently. The idea being the things that you looked at recently are likely to be the things you come back and change again in the future. So it's the things that you're most likely to come back to and to change. So we want to go into the playback menu, and really I want to show you this first thing, and it's the playback display options. And all of the useful stuff is turned off when you first take this camera out of the box. So this is something I would very much recommend changing. And we can highlight or check mark these as we go through to say what kinds of information we would like to have access to when we're reviewing a picture. So, of course, we could just say nothing, image only. I don't find that particularly useful in and of itself, except if we want to see how is this really looking. So we might want to turn it on just to kind of get an overall sense of the image we've taken. But highlights shows you areas that you may have overexposed. A lot of people will call them the blinkies, which is a pretty fun name. RGB histogram, you just got to turn that on. Learning to read a histogram is just going to make you a better photographer. You will know mathematically if you have a properly exposed photograph. It's the best tool you have for that. Shooting data is how the picture was shot. And if you want to go back and look at an image and be able to recreate your success, that's the way to know what you did. So at minimum, I would turn those on. I very well might turn on the image-only review just to get a sense of what you have, but it's less necessary, I would say. We're going to save those changes so that we can have access to these things as we review our images. So when we're reviewing, this allows us to scroll through each one of those review options, reviewing it with highlights, reviewing it with histogram, so forth and so on. Really, really important stuff. But now we're going to go into the shooting menu. This is really what we want to spend our time on today. We could just reset the shooting menu if we wanted to, just to get it back to factory settings. That's what this first piece is inside of here. And you're going to notice many things that are totally duplicated from the quick menu. So image quality, image size. But I want to spend a little bit of time in ISO sensitivity, because what you have access to in the quick menu is simply the ISO sensitivity setting, whether it's 200 or 400 or whatever you decide to select. This is exactly the same as it was before, but these next three options are new to us, so we want to spend some time. We can turn auto ISO on if we want to. Now, this makes the camera automated, and if we are in program mode or aperture priority mode, that might be totally appropriate. What it will do is we will increase from the base sensitivity, our ISO, until we get the picture of the brightness level that we desire. So when you set an ISO with auto ISO turned on, you're setting the floor, and the camera is allowed to go above that number, but never below. Okay? So if we have auto ISO turned on, you would set your ISO sensitivity low so that it could use ISO 100 if there was enough light. This is just a way of quickly being able to give some control to the camera, make it really automated while you're still getting comfortable. Eventually, I would turn this off, but I think it's a nice little tool at your disposal when you're first getting the camera really out of the box, out of the gate. Now, maximum sensitivity is regarding your image quality. Your image quality degrades as we increase our sensitivity to light. And so if we set our maximum sensitivity all the way at 12,800, we would allow the camera to go up to that ISO, thus giving us fast shutter speeds, but really degrading image quality. And you could select really whatever you wanted. I think that 3,200 or 6,400 is quite an appropriate number. But if you spend time with your camera and you learn that you just don't like any image that's shot at ISO 6400, then turn that maximum sensitivity down to 3200. So it defaults at 32. 64 might also be appropriate. Now, the whole reason you change ISO is so that you can achieve faster shutter speeds in darker environments. And so what you're saying is when auto ISO is turned on, what is the minimum shutter speed that you need to have? So you're saying always raise the ISO until we achieve this shutter speed. And this is a minimum, not a maximum. And so you might say something in the 1/125th or 1/60th of a second would be really appropriate. I think those work. I don't really think it makes a lot of sense to have a minimum shutter speed requirement of 1 second or 2 seconds, because you're going to be on a tripod anyway for those shots. So that's not really useful. But something in that 1/125th or 1/60th is important unless you regularly shoot action, in which case it might need to be a 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second. So if I take my son to the park, I'm probably shooting at a minimum of a 1/1000th of a second to get those images. So that's a little bit of an overview on ISO sensitivities. You will eventually get out of the auto ISO world, but it may not be a bad way of starting to get comfortable with using your camera a piece at a time. Now, the rest of this page is mostly things that we have in the quick menu. White balance, we've looked at before. Picture control, we've looked at before. Active D-lighting, we've looked at before. But color space is new to us, and let's go into this and take a look at it. And this is a more nuanced conversation than most people give it credit for. When we are choosing a color space, what we are effectively doing is giving the full range of color that the camera is allowed to record, but it's recorded in a specific way of writing that, which is called the color space, that needs to be read by certain devices. So sRGB is a smaller color space. In other words, it records fewer colors than Adobe RGB does. And that might be a video that I put out at some point is showing you the relative differences there. But what's important is not just, I'm recording more color with Adobe RGB, but can I actually use it? Most monitors in the world only show you sRGB. If you have a computer monitor that shows Adobe RGB or 99% of Adobe RGB, you already know that because you paid more for that monitor and it's advertised really big on it. And I'm working on a Mac, on an iMac for this video, and iMacs across the board are sRGB. And so I'm always going to be working in the sRGB color space. If you're shooting an image and then you're putting it online, your internet browsers and the way that the internet is really programmed is all sRGB. So it doesn't make any sense to edit in Adobe RGB and then load an image specifically for the internet because people are going to be viewing it in sRGB anyway. When you go to print, if you're printing on a mini lab through a store, those are almost exclusively for mini labs sRGB programmed. Now, your inkjet printers, your photo inkjet printers, are typically Adobe RGB. And so, if you're producing an image in some respect, knowing the medium that you're using is important. So, if I'm producing a metal print, for instance, which I really love producing those, though the mechanism that does that is sRGB. And so, it doesn't make sense for me to edit an image in Adobe RGB because that's not the image I'm going to be looking at anyway. But if I'm producing a 20 by 30 poster print, I want to edit that photo into Adobe RGB as my color space. Now, that's a whole lot of different things, and you're thinking about down the line what you're doing with the image. So does it make sense to shoot in sRGB and then try to, in an editing program, make it Adobe RGB? No, that color's already gone. Does it make sense to shoot in Adobe RGB and then try to down convert it to sRGB? That's a little bit trickier because, yeah, you could do it, but you won't necessarily see the difference in your monitor. I think it makes more sense for you to be more comfortable with shooting raw imagery, which does not have a native color space. And when you take a raw image and you edit it in software and you export it for some kind of purpose, you then collapse the color space into either sRGB or Adobe RGB. Now, if you are not comfortable shooting in RAW yet, then you do need to make this decision. And I'll make it easy for you here. If you are editing with an Adobe product, go ahead and shoot Adobe RGB JPEG. Go for it. If you are working with something other than an Adobe software, it doesn't make any sense to shoot that way, shoot sRGB. But either way, you will want to move towards shooting raw images because then you never actually have to choose this at the moment of capture. So that's a little bit about color space. Color is actually a really important subject matter, and it kind of buttresses directly into making decisions about monitor calibration and seeing color appropriately in the moments of capture. And I'm a big fan of monitor calibration, but that is a subject for a different video. So active delighting is an auto enhancement. We've talked about that in our quick menu discussion. I do typically leave it on. I like it. So noise reduction is next. Let's talk about this. This is important. Noise reduction goes in and tries to clean up noise that's produced by higher ISOs in your camera. And this is just an on or an off thing inside of the menu. But let's talk about it. If you are shooting raw images, turn this off. You're going to have better ability to reduce noise in post-processing software than your camera can do in camera. If you are shooting at night, you always turn this off because noise reduction can delete stars out of the sky. If you're shooting more daytime or interior shots, and especially if you really want to avoid your post-processing, go ahead and turn it on. It's not bad. Vignette control. This is trying to correct for vignetting that can happen in lenses. I really can't imagine when I would ever turn this up to high. It can start to look very strange if you have this on high and you're correcting for vignetting that's not there. I would actually turn this down to low or potentially all the way off if I have nicer lenses. But if I'm working with the kit lenses with this camera, I'd probably turn it to low. Now, auto distortion control, you want that on. This is really cool. With any what's called CPU lens, which means that it has electronics in the lens, especially if it's a Nikon lens, then your camera actually understands the distortion characteristics of that lens. We don't try to create an optically perfect lens. It'd be way too expensive and way too big and heavy for have anybody actually buy it. Instead, you make a good lens of varying qualities, and this is getting into a lens conversation that we're going to try to just do a miniature version of, but then you can program an understanding of what distortion characteristics the lens still has, and then the camera can correct it in camera. This is really cool, and it works pretty well, so I like this. I would leave it on. Now we're going to spend just a short period of time on the focus mode and focus area. Of course, we talked about the differences in the quick menu video, so I'm not getting into those. But notice something that you can do. You can decide what type of focus mode is defaulted in your viewfinder versus your live view. Now, your viewfinder, you're going to be changing that regularly as you shoot. I don't like AFA. I'm an AFS or AFC fan, as you learned from the quick menu video, depending on what kind of shooting you're regularly doing. But notice that we also can say live view and movie. The main reason to use the screen as opposed to the viewfinder on this camera is for shooting video. And so it defaults to this single servo AF. But for video, most of the time, I actually find that video is better served with a full-time servo or AFF mode for video shooting because we're constantly searching video. We're constantly focusing when we're shooting video, and I find that to be more useful. And since the screen is predominantly used for shooting video, then I would default that. By the way, I want to point this out. You notice on your camera, one of the buttons has that little question mark next to it. If we press that when we're hovering over anything in the menu, it says, I would like to know more about this menu option, and it will tell you. So it's actually kind of an instruction manual built into your camera. I wanted to take a second and show that to you. It's a very cool thing that Nikon's done for a couple generations of cameras now. But anyway, coming back to this, viewfinder, AFS or AFC, whatever way you shoot. But for the live view and movie, I would definitely do the full-time AFF mode, personally. The autofocus area mode, we can do the exact same thing. And if I'm looking at the live view and movie, most movies are shot of people. So if you're doing video normally of people, I would actually turn on face detection. I think that works really well. Other than that, the defaulted wide area is quite nice. I don't find subject tracking to be as smooth or reliable as I would like with this camera, and so I would typically stay with one of those two. But most video that we shoot is of people, so I would default to using the face detection, personally. I find that quite useful. Built-in autofocus assist illuminator. A lot of people don't know what this is. It's that little bubble that's on the front of the camera that's near the grip. This turns on when you're shooting in a dark environment, and it just turns on while you're focusing to help the camera capture quality focus. So it assists in the autofocus and then turns off for the exposure. Now, this might be really appropriate in most situations, but if you go into a museum, they want you to turn that off. And so that's where it is so that you can do that. So if you're trying to focus in dark environments, that's going to assist you, but do turn that off when you're in a museum or something else like that because they really want you to do that. Metering mode, we talked about in quick menu. And the flash control for built-in flash, I'm going to do a video just on flash later on. I skipped talking about flash in the quick menu video, and I did that because I want to spend some time on it. But just briefly, the built-in flash can be in TTL, which is probably where you want it. That's where the camera decides the amount of power. But you can set the flash manually if you want. Manual flash power is always given as a fraction, just always across the board in photography. And so we have our normal stops here: half power, fourth, eighth, etc. I don't expect most people are going to use this feature too much, just because the pop-up flash with cameras is something that we typically use, if we use it at all, just in the TTL mode. By the way, TTL is the flash speak for a flash set to auto. It stands for through the lens, meaning it's connecting to the through the lens metering of the camera and thus using the metering system of the camera to tell the flash how much power to put out, which is a good place to kind of put it. So I would leave that in TTL. Optical VR, that's just going to be using stabilization. Do turn this off whenever you are on a tripod, because if you don't, it's going to try to keep stabilizing even though the camera's not moving. It'll try to stabilize for the movement of the subject, and you could get less sharp pictures than you would get otherwise. If the camera is being handheld, I would always leave stabilization on. With the exception of really fast shutter speeds, a 2,000th of a second or faster, stabilization can actually fight against your sharpness in those situations. So let's spend a little bit of time on movie settings here, and we're going to have 5 options, and we're going to go through them. Let's start with frame rate. I think there's a lot of confusion regarding frame rate in photography. We've got a lot of choices here that I am not a big fan of. I am not a fan of is 24 frames a second. So that 1080-24, I dislike that immensely. And I'll tell you why. So let's talk a little bit about frame rates. This is something that you should just be able to set and never touch again. But your frame rate and your shutter speed should be mathematically aligned to each other. So if you're shooting, let's say, a 30th of a second shutter speed, then your frame rate wants to be 30 frames a second, right? Or 60, because that's mathematically related. That's perfect. And that way, your shutter and the end of your frame line up together, and you get slightly smoother motion when you do that. So why do I say that I dislike 24 frames a second? The reason that I do is there is no way in this camera to manually select a 1/48th of a second shutter speed. It doesn't exist. You can't select it. With old video cameras where we selected not the shutter speed, what was called the shutter angle, you could do that, and you could mathematically connect the effective shutter speed, what was called the shutter angle, what's still called shutter angle inside of the menus of cameras, and the 24 frames a second that film was passed through the camera. So the reason that 24 frames a second exists, by the way, just a little historical anecdote for you. When we were starting to figure out movies, making movies, movie projection, they did tests on how many frames a second they could play back video at. And they found that if they played back video at 23 frames a second, people saw the forest for the trees. They could see that slight jerkiness that exists because they're looking at still images rather than video. But the second they went to 24, it was the first number where that didn't happen. In other words, it was the least number of frames per second that they could show and still have smooth-looking video. So it was a cost-saving thing. That's it. That's all 24 frames a second ever was a cost-saving thing for studios that had to buy film by the ton. We don't have that concern, and so we should be selecting something that makes sense for the way cameras operate today. And today, you're shooting video on a DSLR. You can shoot a 30th of a second or a 60th of a second, and so your frame rate should be 30 or 60. You shoot 60 frames a second for only one reason, and that's because you might want to do slow motion in the future. If you shoot 60 and play back 60 and shoot 30 and play back 30, no one will ever know the difference. But if you want to shoot video and be able to do slow motion, you will do much better with 60 frames a second. You'll just have more information to work with. So one way that you can save space on your memory card when shooting video is to shoot 30 frames a second, so long as you know that you're never going to do slow motion. I do shoot 60 frames a second when I'm doing video, and it's every now and then I've done slow motion, and maybe I should switch it back to 30 just because I really don't do it that often, and I'm breaking my own advice, but there it is. I guess people do strange things sometimes. But 60 or 30 is the way that I would set this for sure, and that'll work fine for you. Movie quality, I think this is a no-brainer. Nikon does the same thing in video that they do in stills, which is where their cameras come out of the box, not set to the top image quality. I would always buy a larger memory card and shoot at high quality. I don't see a reason why not. So this is going to be our microphone control. And I want you to see we have auto sensitivity or manual sensitivity. Auto sensitivity does some interesting things. If the sound volume is consistent with whatever you're shooting, auto sensitivity is actually totally fine. There's no problem with it. However, if you get inconsistent audio levels, then for a second to 2 seconds, the sensitivity will still be set at the previous amount. So I'll give you an example. This affects my life shooting video quite a bit. If I have a lapel mic hooked up to a camera and I have auto sensitivity turned on with the camera, then I actually need to talk for a few seconds before pressing record. Otherwise, when I start speaking, I'm much louder than the sensitivity the camera was at, and I get really clipped and bad audio right at the very beginning. If you're wanting to set up a microphone either because you have inconsistent audio levels or because you can plan your shot, you could do manual, but otherwise auto is totally appropriate. Now, wind noise reduction, less that we need to worry about here. This is defaulted to turning off in the menu. Leave it off unless you are picking up wind noise. This will really dampen the range of what it can record. So if you shoot indoors and you have wind noise reduction turned on, this can be a big problem because you're going to get really unnatural sounding audio. So leave this off until you are outside. Now, manual movie settings, you really do just want to go ahead and turn this on. It's not going to affect your life until you're shooting your video in manual mode. But when you do that, you'll have different screen options, the ability to change your exposure completely on the fly while shooting in manual, and you'll get that noticed change in brightness on the screen, so you can really make intelligent decisions as you're shooting that. So you really do want to turn that on. And that is going to be the introduction to the camera shooting menu here with the Nikon D3500. I hope that was useful for you. So I'm going to head back to the studio.
Wonderful. Thank you for sticking around and enjoying that. I very much appreciate it. I hope that was useful to you. In an upcoming video, I will go through the tools menu of the 3500 in depth. I have not decided yet if I'm going to do a video on the playback and retouching menus in depth, but if you want to see it, get into the comments, let me know, and I'll certainly make that for you. Check out some of the other videos that I've got on this channel on some lenses, on shooting tips and techniques, on other things that I explore. And of course, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. It's free. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.